And now to present today's 2 o'clock program in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we're focusing on the theme of the fourth gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic. We delightedly welcome back John Shelby Spong, the retired Episcopal Bishop of Newark, and a creative scriptural interpreter and master storyteller. Bishop, listening to your lecture yesterday and noting that a certain amount of fear of those who claim to know God is justified, I also thought of Dostoevsky's observation that if there be no God, all things are permissible. Some of the great theology of the 20th century was written in response to the problem of evil: the Holocaust, slavery and its aftermath, the oppression of women, violence against LGBT communities, and so on. Theology must help us. In the memorable words of our chaplain of the week, Joanna Adams, to face the storms of life with courage and grace. And I like the way that Abraham Joshua Heschel put it in his wonderful book, The Prophets, which should be on all of your reading lists if it isn't. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement, as many of you did, said these words: "Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profane riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words," end quote. The title of Bishop Spong's lecture today is "The Mother of Jesus, a Symbol of Judaism." I'll remind you once again that Jack will be doing a book signing tomorrow after this lecture. The signing will take place on the porch of the Hall of Missions, and what books that are left will be sold there as well. We urge you to pre-order Bishop Spong's lecture series this week from the gazebo today. Given the popularity and demand, this would ensure that we'll have appropriate stock available. It would also allow for the gazebo to convey when the best times might be for you to pick up your copies tomorrow. You'll also be pleased to know that Bishop Spong writes a weekly column on the internet. If you're interested in learning more about it, there is a sign-up sheet on the table out in front of the Hall of Missions today. We're most grateful to the Eileen and Warren Martin Lectureship for Emerging Studies in Bible and Theology for its support of today's lecture, a lectureship given to honor the loving memory of Warren Martin's beloved wife, Eileen. We're grateful that he and Claudia, his and Eileen's daughter, are here with us this week. And Warren and Claudia, we thank you again for your support. Let's thank them. So please now join me in extending a very warm welcome to our friend, Bishop John Shelby Spong.
Thank you, sir. The most beautiful woman in the world, to whom I am married, informed me last night at dinner that in response to one of the questions, I didn't do a very good job. And that was the question about how do you continue to participate in traditional worship with your kind of theology? I invite that person to ask that question again today. I prepared well. I want to note a common theme in Chautauqua's program today. Joanna Adams opened her service this morning with a Fred Kahn hymn entitled "God of Eve and God of Mary." Jules Pfeiffer talked about killing my mother. Today I will look at John's gospel portrait of the mother of Jesus. So welcome to Mother's Day, Chautauqua style. I want to bring into focus this afternoon a crucial Johannine interpretive character. Now, this character was obviously a figure of history. Everyone has to have a mother. That's the only way we get into this world. But I will suggest that John's portrait of her has turned this character into being far more than just a figure of history. She has become, in this gospel, a powerful interpretive image. She's played a powerful role in the Christian story. She is familiar to some degree to every person who is in this room today. A professor of history at Virginia Military Institute who collects what she calls obscene religious trinkets has just sent to me in the past week a fingernail clipper that also opens bottles that has the Virgin's picture inscribed upon it. I don't quite know what that connection is, but she's also sent me many other images of what she calls obscene religious trinketry. John calls her simply the mother of Jesus. He never calls her Mary. We noted in the first day that the only Marys to appear in the fourth gospel are Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha. And you need to know that there are some biblical scholars that think Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha, are one and the same person. When I was talking in the bullet points on the first day, I mentioned that there is no miraculous vision of the birth of Jesus in the fourth gospel. John has simply dropped the virgin birth story out of the tradition as far as his gospel is concerned. And more than that, on two different occasions in the fourth gospel, once in chapter 1 and once in chapter 6, he refers to Jesus quite simply as the son of Joseph. And most people are surprised when they discover that. John, however, does feature two stories in his corpus in which the mother of Jesus is the star. The first one is in chapter 2. The last one is in chapter 19. So they almost serve as bookends for this gospel. I want to look at both of them briefly. The mother of Jesus appears in chapter 2 in the story of Jesus changing water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. That is a strange story in a number of aspects. First, please note that that story has never appeared in any written Christian tradition before this moment. And before John writes, some 65 to 70 years have passed. So if this story actually happened, nobody thought it was worthy of talking about for 65 years. That's a rather strange way to treat a story that you might think is important. Secondly, in this water into wine story, the mother of Jesus is presented in the narrative as the mother of the groom. That's why they go to her when the wine has become exhausted. She's responsible for entertaining. It's the groom's family. Which leads you to ask a question: if she's the mother of the groom, who do you suppose the groom is? Another interesting aspect. In this story, Jesus rebukes his mother fairly harshly as he perceives her trying to force his hand to move before the moment is right for him to move, the moment of revelation. And he does this with these words. When she goes to him and says, "They've run out of wine," he says, "Woman, what is that to you? My hour has not yet come." Now, you might need to be aware that if you keep reading John's Gospel, you get to chapter 7, and some aspects of that story get repeated. This time, it is not the mother of Jesus, it is the brothers of Jesus that try to force his hand, force him to go up to Jerusalem before he's ready to reveal who he is in Jerusalem. And Jesus rebukes them with similar words. My time, my hour has not yet come. Another aspect of this story worthy of some notice. Despite the rebuke of the mother of Jesus by her son, she still instructs the servants at this wedding feast to do everything that Jesus directs them to do. And then you began to see the furniture being put into this story. There just happened to be 6 stone jars present in that room that were filled with water for the Jewish rites of purification. Perhaps that was for the ceremonial bath that marked the process by which non-Jews became Jews, the ceremonial bath, and then they were welcomed to the Passover meal. Jesus orders these water pots to be filled. And then he draws from these water pots and serves the steward of the feast. And the water has now been turned, according to the story, into exquisite wine. Now, please note that in this episode, the mother of Jesus stands between the waters of Jewish purification and the wine of the Christian Eucharist. It's important to note that she's the transition figure. And that is the only time that the mother of Jesus appears in John's Gospel until you reach the very end, until you come to the story of the crucifixion. And so the second and last time that she appears in John's Gospel, she is at the foot of the cross, and she is accompanied by the person we spent our time yesterday trying to lift out of this text. He's called simply the disciple whom Jesus loved. So the mother of Jesus and the ideal disciple alone stand at the foot of the cross. And Jesus speaks to them. Once again, this is a story that has never been told before. There is no record of in any earlier gospel where the mother of Jesus was actually at the cross. This is her first appearance. But Jesus, according to John, addresses his mother directly. And these are his words: "Woman, behold your son." And then speaking to the beloved disciple, he says, "Behold your mother." Now, just as with the waters in the miracle story at Cana of Galilee, there are some fascinating things about this story if you pay attention to John's text. The first one I've just mentioned, that story is brand new. That's never been told before. Most people have a hard time imagining that the mother of Jesus is not at the cross in Mark, Matthew, or Luke. For most of Christian art has portrayed her constantly, cradling the deceased body of her son at the foot of the cross. Mel Gibson couldn't have made his movie if that hadn't been in John's Gospel. Jesus spoke from the cross in Matthew and Mark only to say, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Nothing else. When you get to Luke, Luke drops that cry of dereliction. It never appears again. And Luke adds a far more positive final word for Jesus. "Not my God, why have you forsaken me? But Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Luke also adds some other words that we've never heard of before at the cross. Perhaps inspired by 2nd Isaiah's portrait of the suffering servant, where the prophet says, "The servant made intercession for his transgressors." Luke adds 2 additional sayings. Luke makes intercession for the soldiers, his transgressors, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then Jesus speaks again, making intercession for the one that we call the penitent thief. It might be interesting for you to note that the penitent thief does not get penitent until Luke's gospel. He's not penitent in Mark. He's not penitent in Matthew. He's not penitent in John. He's only penitent in Luke's gospel. And Luke has Jesus speak the assuring word to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus makes intercession for his tormentors. Another thing you need to note about this particular part of the cross story in John: this is the first time that the mother of Jesus has made it to the cross. The third item: if the suggestion that the disciple whom Jesus loved, as we developed yesterday, was a symbol and not a person, as Rudolf Bultmann has suggested, and a conclusion with which I completely agree, then is it possible that if John brings this symbolic, ideal disciple to the foot of the cross and couples her with the mother of Jesus, that maybe he is presenting the mother of Jesus also as a symbol? And if so, a symbol of what? Now let me say it's very difficult to talk about the figure of the Virgin Mary from an historical perspective, because over the centuries she has become so powerful a devotional symbol to so many people that to look at her only through the eyes of history will appear to some to be something of a sacrilege. The fact is, however, that the Virgin presented in the Bible is vastly different from the Virgin presented in the tradition of Christian history. So what I want to do today is to try to separate the biblical portrait of the mother of Jesus from the later historical development of her symbolic characteristics. That will not be easy, so listen carefully. If you want to read a book about how the Virgin develops in history as a symbol, may I suggest the best book I've ever read on that subject is by a young Roman Catholic woman author named Marina Warner, and her book is entitled "Alone of All Her Sex." Today, let me just seek to clarify what the Bible says about the mother of Jesus. And then I'll file quickly, almost by title, what has happened in the history of the development of the Virgin in the Christian tradition. There's a sportscaster who's not active today named Bob Wolf that used to say, "Let's go to the tape. I want to go to the text." I want to look at the Bible in the order in which it was written, and watch the figure of the mother of Jesus emerge as it did in history. Paul was the first writer of anything to appear in the New Testament. Paul wrote between 51 and 64. There are 14 books in the New Testament that at one time or another have been attributed to Paul. The overwhelming scholarly probability is that he only wrote 7 of them. 3 of them were written maybe a decade after his death, those being Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians, and they were probably written by some of Paul's disciples. And 3 of them were written a generation after Paul's death, in which time Paul has become not the controversial figure that he was, but the revered elder statesman. I hope to live long enough to be the revered elder statesman. And that would be 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. I don't know of any biblical scholar that thinks Paul is the author of those 6 books. And the 7th one would be Hebrews, and I know of no one except the King James Bible that thinks Paul wrote Hebrews. I could make a better case for Robert Franklin being the author of Hebrews than I could make for Paul. So let's look at what Paul says about the family of origin of Jesus. This is 51 to 64. Paul has no mention of a miraculous birth. Did he just leave it out, or had he never heard of it? Well, you examine the rest of Paul to try to answer that question. All he says about the origins of Jesus are these 3 things. 1, he was born of a woman. Does that strike you as unusual? That's in Galatians. That's written about 52. That's the earliest reference we have. In that same sentence, he says, he was born under the law. He was born of a woman like every other human being. He was born under the law like every other Jew. And then 4 years later, when he writes the Romans, he says to the Romans in the first 4 verses that Jesus was descended from the house of David according to the flesh. That's the first time that messianic idea that the Messiah has to be heir to the throne of David is mentioned in the Christian tradition. It will grow through the tradition. But that's all Paul says. None of that sounds supernatural. None of that sounds miraculous. The probability is that Paul had never heard of the miraculous birth tradition because it had not yet developed. Now, Paul does say one other thing that in retrospect gets controversial. Paul talks about the brother of Jesus. He calls his name. It is James. He mentions him in Galatians, his second epistle. And Paul doesn't like him. He has really harsh things to say about James, the Lord's brother. But that's the witness of Paul, and that's all we have. So we move about a decade further in history, and we come to the first gospel to be written, the one we call Mark. And scholars to date it a couple of years after the fall of Jerusalem, which would mean about the year 72. Once again, there is no birth story in the earliest gospel to be written. It simply is not there. And there is nothing in Mark's gospel that leads us to believe that the author of Mark's gospel had ever heard of this tradition. And there are a number of things in Mark's gospel that seem to argue that he had not heard of this tradition. The first one is that in the opening chapter of Mark, Mark brings Jesus, who is a fully mature adult human being, to be baptized. And Mark says it was in the baptism that the heavens opened and the Spirit of God descended and God named him God's Son. Presumably to Mark, he was not God's Son before that baptismal moment. That's a rather interesting thing to ponder. It's not from conception that he becomes divine in Mark, it's from baptism. But the other and probably more important thing occurs in chapter 3. In chapter 3, the mother of Jesus is portrayed as believing that Jesus has become mentally disturbed. And she moves to take him away, retire him from public life. And she's accompanied in this, says Mark, and this is in the Bible. You don't need to take my word for it. Go read it, chapter 3. It says that she goes with Jesus' brothers to take him away. And once again, he rebukes her. This is when he says, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Those that hear the word of God and respond to it are my mother and my brothers and my sisters." And then there's an episode in chapter 6 of Mark where the origins of Jesus are being discussed. He's just preached in his hometown synagogue, and people think, where did this man get all this learning? And someone shouts out of the crowd, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" And that's the first time in Christian history that the name Mary has been given as the mother of Jesus. That's the 8th decade. She doesn't get the name Mary in the written tradition until the 8th decade. And also let me suggest that in the first century, when you call an adult male the son of his mother, you are being pejorative and you are raising questions about his legitimacy and his paternity, if you understand how the Jewish language works. You move next to Matthew. Matthew is generally dated about 85, so it's in the middle years of the 9th decade. And it's in the middle years of the 9th decade that for the first time in Christian history, the story of the miraculous birth of Jesus enters the tradition. And Matthew bases it on a text from Isaiah 7:14. And Isaiah interprets or translates that text to read, quote, "Behold, a virgin will conceive." Now, the only trouble with that translation is that that's not what Isaiah's text says. Isaiah's text says, "Behold, a woman is with child." And we've known that since the dialogue of Trypho with Justin Martyr in the early years of the 2nd century. Now, there's a pretty big difference between "Behold, a virgin will conceive" and "Behold, a woman is with child." Maybe things are different in Atlanta. But where I come from, if a woman is with child, she's not a virgin. That just sort of seems ipso facto. So Matthew seems to know that he's introducing this powerful story with a rather weak text. Not the first time a preacher's used a text that didn't really fit what he was going to say. And so what Matthew does, it seems to me, is to give some additional cushioning to that text. And he does it in the first 17 verses of Matthew's gospel, which are by every measure the 17 most boring verses in the entire New Testament. Nobody reads them. We skip over them because that's the who begat whom chapter. 17 verses of who begat whoms. You try to read that in church on Sunday morning as the morning lesson, and somebody will throw hymn books before you're finished. But you ought to read those 17 verses because they're powerful. Matthew chooses this way to introduce the miraculous birth story. And if you read that genealogy very carefully, you will discover that Matthew has placed 4 women into Jesus' ancestral background. They're not unknown women. They're women whose story is in the Bible. You can go to it tonight and read their stories. It's unusual enough to put women into the genealogy because nobody counted women as very valuable. They hadn't discovered yet that women had an egg cell. They didn't think women had any role in procreation except to be the incubators in which the male's child was brought to life. Now, I don't have time to develop these women, but they're marvelous stories. I'll do it in the book on Matthew that I'm writing at this moment, but that's a couple of years away. But let me just say that all 4 of these women are, first of all, women, which makes them unusual, and secondly, all 4 of them, by the standards of that day, are sexually tainted women. Now ask yourself why he's giving you this data just before he introduces the miraculous story of Jesus' birth. The first one is a woman named Tamar, and you can read her story in chapter 38 of Genesis, and she's guilty of incest. She becomes pregnant by her father-in-law. The second woman is a woman who stars in Joshua chapter 2 and chapter 6. Her name is Rahab, and her nickname is Rahab the prostitute. The third woman is guilty of seduction. Her name is Ruth. And you will find her story in the little book by her name. But don't skip the 3rd chapter. That's where Boaz drinks himself to the point where he is asleep on the floor. And Ruth puts a pillar under his head and a blanket over his body. And then she climbs in under the blanket. And the next morning when Boaz wakes up, he says, "Who are you?" And she says, "Marry me." That's a pretty overt act of seduction, wouldn't you think? Go read the story. We sing a song at a lot of weddings that we take out of the book of Ruth. You might have heard it. "Entreat me not to leave you. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die. And where you are buried, I will be buried." It's a beautiful love song. The only problem is Ruth sings it to her mother-in-law. I think if people getting married were to realize that Ruth sings it to her mother-in-law and not to her husband, they might not choose that for their for their story. But the fourth one is also intriguing, and you'll find her story in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And Matthew does not name her. He just says she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. But everyone who knows the Bible story knows that the wife of Uriah the Hittite is named Bathsheba. And she is guilty of an adulterous relationship with King David. So in the chapter that opens and introduces the virgin birth in the first book of the Bible where it is ever mentioned, we are told about 4 women of tainted sexual background who are Jesus' immediate ancestors. What in the world do you suppose Matthew is trying to communicate? Well, I can't go into that. That's 2 years from now. That book will come out. But let's move on. Our analysis is just to get the biblical facts. We move to Luke. Luke is a harder book to date. And there are some people whom I respect a great deal that don't think Luke was written until about the year 140. One is Marcus Borg, good friend of mine. But I think he's wrong. I date Luke in the late years of the 9th decade or the early years of the 10th decade, somewhere between 89 and 93. But Luke also tells the story of the miraculous birth of Jesus. He does not use the Isaiah text. I think he recognizes it's too weak to carry the load. But he includes most of the essentials, and you and I are far more familiar with Luke's story than we are Matthew's, because Luke's story is the storyline we use in Christmas pageants. And then we get to the end of the pageant and we tack on Matthew's wise men as if they fit at that point. They don't really, but I mean, who are we to upset a good pageant? It is interesting, however, to note that Luke is also the only gospel that tells us that when Jesus was 12 years of age, he went up to the temple in Jerusalem. I suspect that was something like an early bar mitzvah experience for him. Remember, Luke is the one that has him circumcised on the 7th day, presented on the 40th day, and bar mitzvah at age 12, except they didn't quite do bar mitzvah then. But it was sort of a pre-bar mitzvah kind of thing. When Jesus goes up to the temple in this story, and it's the only childhood story of Jesus in the entire Bible, he gets lost. That is, he stays behind. His parents go ahead. They don't know where he is. And some language is very interesting. Jesus is lost for 3 days. After the crucifixion, he's going to be lost for 3 days. And Mary and Joseph go back to find him. And when they find him, Mary says to Jesus, rather harshly, "Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." Your father and I? And that's all there is in Luke. The mother of Jesus appears in Luke only again in the book of Acts at the Pentecost experience. And then we come to John. John omits the birth story altogether. It's interesting that of the 5 major authors in the New Testament, Paul and Mark seem never to have heard of the birth story. Matthew and Luke tell the birth story, and John appears to have rejected the birth story. So it's 3-2 against the birth story being a legitimate part of the tradition in the Bible itself. John omits it, and he refers, as I've mentioned before, on 2 occasions to Jesus simply as the son of Joseph. And then he adds 2 stories about the mother of Jesus where she appears far more to be a symbol than she appears to be a person of history. Now that's all the biblical data there is about Mary. All. There's not another reference anywhere. That's it. That's the entirety. But the story of the Virgin began to grow in Christian history. And the myth of the Virgin has developed into a powerful symbol. Let me just trace it very briefly. She's not a virgin in Paul and Mark. She becomes a virgin in Matthew and remains one in Luke. By the 2nd century, she has become, quote, a perpetual virgin, unquote. This means that she would never have children except the child Jesus. So all those brothers and sisters that are mentioned in Mark and in Paul and in John suddenly became either half-siblings or cousins. By the 4th century, the church said that she was not only a virgin mother and a perpetual virgin, but she was also a postpartum virgin. Now that took some hard work. They had to maintain that even though she bore Jesus as her child, her virginity remained intact. The stories were actually circulating about the fact that Jesus was born out of her ear. We don't sort of enjoy those stories today because they're so weird. But if you go back and read that period of church history when the fathers were trying to get this established, one of the ways you establish doctrine was that you ground it in Scripture. So they went back to the Hebrew prophets and tried to find some place where the prophets predicted the postpartum virginity of the Virgin Mary. Now that's fairly hard to find, but they found it. Go home and read it. It's in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 1, and I quote, listen carefully, and the gates of the city were shut, and only the Lord could come in and out, unquote. And without embarrassment, they used that text to undergird and justify the developing doctrine of the postpartum virginity of the Blessed Virgin. So as Mary grows in history, she is systematically desexed. Let me ask you just a question. If the Christian tradition suggests that the ideal woman is a perpetual virgin, ask yourself the question, to whom? And the answer is so simple. A perpetual virgin is an ideal woman to a celibate male. Who do you think was making the definition? I submit that women ought to have a chance to define themselves, not just a group of celibate males. But that's another fact. By the time you get to the 19th century, and this is pretty late, Mary begins the process of being dehumanized. She was desexed in the first 5 centuries. Now she begins the process of being dehumanized. So in the 19th century, in the latter years of the 19th century, she was declared immaculately conceived. That is, the mother of Jesus was born without the corruption of original sin. The fascinating thing is that by this time, the scientific world had discovered in England, about the year 1725, that women had an egg cell. That was unknown before then. And if women have an egg cell, they provide 50% of the genetic code of every child that has ever been born. And every woman is as much a daughter of Adam as every son is a son of Adam, so every woman is corrupted with Adam's sin. And so in order to preserve the sacred birth of Jesus, immaculate conception for his mother, which took care of her sin before Jesus was conceived, was developed. Theology does know how to adapt to reality after a while. And then finally in 1950, Mary was declared bodily assumed into heaven. This doctrine said she didn't really die. God raised her to the divine presence, just like God had raised Elijah in a fiery chariot to the divine presence. Now, when the Roman Church declared that Mary had been bodily assumed into heaven, the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung said, "This is the most important doctrine in Western history." What that meant to Jung was that finally, in Western civilization, the feminine had been raised into the presence of God. But I'm a bit concerned that before a male-dominated society and a male-dominated church can suggest that the feminine has been raised into the meaning of God, that they had to desex her and dehumanize her. That tells you something about how men really think about women. So Mary, I suggest, was far more a symbol in Christian history than she was a person. And this symbol began, I believe, long before the Bible had finished being written. Surely she is a symbol by the time John's Gospel is written. Of what is she a symbol? She's so clearly a symbol of Judaism. The mother of Jesus has become Judaism, the mother of Christianity. And that's so clear in what John does. John was deeply Jewish, and John was deeply cut off from his own Jewish roots. He had been expelled from the synagogue. So he is living in this tension. Mary in John's Gospel always stands at the transition point between Judaism and Christianity. She stands at that transition point when the waters of Jewish purification are said to have been transformed into the wine of the Christian Eucharist. She's the catalyst at that moment. And she stands at the cross with the symbolic figure of the beloved disciple, the ideal disciple, the disciple that will go all the way with Jesus, the disciple that fully understands. She appears with this symbol. If Mary, the mother of Jesus, is a symbol of Judaism in John's Gospel, and if the beloved disciple is a symbol of the ideal Christian, then go back now and look at that story where Jesus confronts the beloved disciple and his mother at the foot of the cross, and listen to it from a different perspective. These two symbolic figures stand before him, the mother of Judaism and the ideal Christian. And Jesus turns to the symbol of Judaism, and he says to his mother, "Behold your son." Christianity is your child. You are this child's mother. You are not enemies. Behold your child. Own your child. Remember that Christianity you birthed. Acknowledge your own progeny. And then he turns to the beloved disciple, the symbol of the Christian movement. And Jesus says to him, "You behold your mother. Don't ever forget your roots. Don't forget that from which you have come. Recognize that you are the child of Judaism. Do not spit on your mother." I submit to you that the story then becomes a very different message and a very powerful message. And it calls both Jew and Christian to a new relationship of mutuality and respect. John is not writing a literal story. He is writing a powerful but symbolic, interpretive narrative. He is painting an interpretive portrait. I hope someday we might come to understand his gospel properly. Tomorrow I will turn to the climax of this gospel, the story of the crucifixion. And I hope that I can show that in John's story of the cross, the ultimate meaning of the reality of God is set before us. So I hope you will join us, same time, same station. Thank you very much. We'll follow the same procedure. Every other question must come from a woman. I'd like the first question to come from a woman. I'd like for the women to line up on one side, and I don't care which. Either way, somebody said he's dividing the men and women just like we used to do in the synagogue. No, it's not what I'm doing. I'm just trying to give women equal voice. That's all I'm trying to do. No hidden agenda. I think it's time for the church to listen to the voices of all of its people. And I hope your questions will be brief. I even hope more that my answers will be brief. And we'll try to get in as many as we can. So we'll take the first lady. Yes, ma'am.
I'm here to repeat my question from yesterday.
I'm almost as surprised as when I go to a session at Chautauqua and I'm told we're going to have some announcements.
Do I have to repeat it or you just go on?
Yeah, go ahead for everybody here.
Yesterday, I basically said that I'm dissatisfied with the traditional church and I'm having troubles finding fulfillment. And I need help in finding that.
Let me try to do better than I did yesterday, according to my wife, whose judgment I always accept. I am a smart man. I also married well. I go to church every Sunday of my life. I must say it was a little easier when I was the bishop because I could change the liturgy around to suit myself. Bishops get away with murder. But the church I attend is a very important part of my life. And sometimes the liturgy is 13th century. Sometimes the hymns are god-awful. But I still go. I go because the story is so much greater than the words through which the story is communicated. And I've developed a means of separating those. I go because the creeds, even though they reflect a 4th century worldview, creeds assume a 3-tiered universe with the earth at the center, and I don't know anybody since Copernicus in the educated world that's thought that way, but the creeds still state that. If you read the creeds carefully, you'll find a 3-tier escalator. Going up, God comes down, Jesus descends, Jesus rises, Jesus ascends. You see the 3 tiers. And I don't believe that. You don't believe that. I don't know anybody that believes that. So why do we keep saying it? Because it's the faith of the church that we put into music in the 4th century, and we don't want to turn our back on our own history. The creed is a love song. It's not a theological document. And when you're singing a love song, you can use excessive and poetic and non-literal language. I tell my beloved Christine every day of her life that she's the most beautiful woman in the world, and she knows that I mean that. But she also knows I haven't examined the other 3.5 billion women in the world to make sure that's objectively true. She knows that's the language of love. The creeds are love songs that the 4th century sang to their understanding of God, and I have no trouble joining in the 4th century. If I were going to write the creeds today, would I use 4th century words? Of course not. But I'm part of that tradition, and so I don't want to step outside of it. I don't want to reject it. The liturgy does change. In my church, about every 50 years, we revise the prayer book. And when we get it revised, it's only about 2 centuries out of date. And by the time people get over the trauma of the prayer book being revised, there's still an organization in my church called the Society for the Preservation of the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, even though we're about to revise the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. They finally get over it because the world catches up with everybody. We have 2 things in the 1928 prayer book that I couldn't stand. One was we interpreted childbirth to be something evil. Before a woman could be allowed back into the church, she had to go through a service called the churching of women. We had to clean her up before we'd let her back in. I don't believe that. Childbirth's not evil. And then we had a service called the visitation of the sick. It's about 10 pages long. If you were sick when it started, you'd be dead by the time it got finished. But the worst thing of all was that it assumed that your sickness was God's punishing you for your sinfulness. They didn't know about germs and viruses. That's a 19th century addition to our knowledge. So they interpreted sickness as God punishing you for your sinfulness. So the prayer book changes and worship changes and concepts change, but you've got to be part of that flow. And I must say, I really love going to my church. I miss it when I'm away. I think the thing I missed most when I was a bishop is that I didn't have a community of faith in which I lived and people with whom I shared that on a regular basis. And our best friends are members of this congregation today. And they're really nice to me because they treat me like a person. We've got an incredible rector. If you ever looked at that English program called The Vicar of Dibley, she looks like the Vicar of Dibley. She comes out of a New York theater family. Her name is Janet Broderick. She's got a brother named Matthew Broderick that some of you might know. She's got a sister-in-law named Sarah Jessica Parker that some of you might know. But she's an incredible priest. And she has the capacity in her sermons to make herself vulnerable without becoming an exhibitionist. That's a rare, fine line. And when she makes herself vulnerable, she speaks to the emotions of people because they can hear it because she's in the pit with them. I think she's a fantastic rector. And I don't ever want to be apart from that community. Now, do I work for change? Yes. Every time I'm home, I teach the adult class. And they're sort of used to going where I'm going at this point. And people are coming to that class that haven't come to church in years. So people begin to see that there's something so much more to this Christian story than what they've been taught. And liturgy so often just affirms that nothing has changed for 1,000 years. So I sort of accept those limitations and still put myself in the community and separate myself from the literalness of some of the text in liturgy and things like the creeds. I still believe the creeds, if that's what you want to ask. I am a Trinitarian, if that's what you want to ask. I don't think God's a Trinity. And that always upsets people. They can't make that distinction. I say I'm a Trinitarian because I'm talking about my experience. I experience God as ultimately other, beyond anything I can imagine, and that's what Father means. I experience God as infinite depth within, deeper than my breathing, and that's what Spirit means. And I experience God coming to me always incarnate through the lives of human beings. And that's what the Son means. So I have no trouble saying I'm a Trinitarian. But do I turn around and say, therefore, God is a Trinity? I think that's idolatry. I cannot tell God what God is. God might have 16 sides, and I've only experienced 3 of them. I can't bind God with my limitations. So I still worship, and I love it, and I miss it. We haven't been in our home parish in how many weeks now? It's been a long time. I sit right behind the lady who runs the altar guild, and she's just like every altar guild woman I've ever met in my life. And she's just plain lovely. Do I like everything that happens? Let me tell you one quick story. We have a family in our church that we're very close to. They've served in every office you can imagine in that church. They came to that church about 30 years ago, from Atlanta, as a matter of fact. I think from the cathedral. And they've been at the core. They had 2 children, 2 precious little girls. When I met the family, one was 4 months old in arms and the other was about 4 years old. When that first child, the 4-year-old, graduated from Vanderbilt and started teaching school out in the state of Washington, she was quite athletic, and she was a rappeler, is that what you call it? She climbed mountains with ropes. And her ropes broke, and she fell 465 feet to her instant death. And the congregation gathered around that precious family and lived in that trauma with them. 4 years later, almost to the day, the second little girl, now 24 or 25 years old, was swimming with her boyfriend off the coast of India and was eaten by a crocodile. This family, both of their children killed in freak accidents at the prime of life. And the congregation, I know what it means to be the people of God. And our rector, what do you do? What do you say? Our rector sent out an email blast to the congregation to tell them what had happened and said that tonight at 6 o'clock, I'll be in the church and I'll be saying prayers. Still can't talk about it. And if anybody would like to be with me, I'd welcome them. 200 members of that congregation showed up at 6 o'clock just to be together. That's what it means to talk about the community of the Holy Spirit. So I'm an avid, regular worshiper in my church, and it's part of my responsibility to help turn that church outward toward what it can become. And I think that's everybody else's responsibility. If you listen to our preacher this morning, that's what she was saying. Forgive me. Yes, sir.
I have a technical question. If Jesus spoke Aramaic and these Gospels written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin and translated back and forth, as a historian, how much credence do you put in that, in what you finally end up with? And in that regard, could it be possible that Jesus is a composite figure?
Well, you asked two really interesting questions, and you coalesce them together with an interesting twist. To the best of our knowledge, Jesus and his disciples spoke only Aramaic. They may well have known some Greek words because Sepphoris was a town, a very Greek town, fairly near them, and the world of business had to know some Greek. And I've been down on the Rio Grande, and everybody on both sides of the Rio Grande speaks some Spanish. But that doesn't mean you speak Spanish. So by the time you and I read the first words that we read in the Bible that are attributed to Jesus, 42 years at a minimum has passed. That's about 2 generations. And one translation has taken place from the Aramaic in which it was spoken to the Greek in which it is written. So I find it hard to be literal about any of it. I don't know that, I can't imagine anything I said 42 years ago that anybody would ever remember literally. And I can't imagine there's such a thing as a perfect translation. I can't resist telling you my favorite translation story. I was lecturing across Finland. I don't know a word of Finnish. And I had a Finnish translator, and he looked like he had come out of the North Country. He was about 6 feet tall. He probably weighed about 300 pounds. He had a red beard and a red mustache, and his stomach started at about his chin and went out like that. And he happens to be a close friend. He's a Lutheran pastor in Solvang, California. But he's native Finnish, and he speaks Finnish beautifully, and he speaks English beautifully. So he stood beside me. We didn't have manuscripts, so I did a sentence, and he translated. I have no idea what he said. But I know at one point in that presentation, I used the phrase gay and straight. And he translated it happy and a ruler. Now, the only way I know that he did that was that somebody in the congregation who spoke English better than Yarmo said, "You didn't get that right, Yarmo," and then she straightened him out. That just helps me know there's no such thing as a perfect translation. So before you begin to dig into the Jesus figure, you've got to go through a translation, and you've got to go through 40 years of oral transmission. Now, I don't have time to develop what I think happened in that 40 years. That's another story. To go to your more important question, is it possible that Jesus is a composite? Yes and no. There's no doubt in my mind that there was a figure named Jesus of Nazareth who inspired such an incredible response that they were convinced that they had confronted God in him. The original Jesus experience, I believe, is quite intact and quite powerful. But then they had to explain it. And when you begin to explain an experience, you always do so in the time and space in which you live, in the concepts that you know, in the level of knowledge that you possess. And so there is no such thing as an eternal explanation. There might be an eternal experience, but there's never an eternal explanation. And what the church has done is to try to make our explanations eternal. And that's what's breaking down in our world. And that's just not possible. If you can explain God in Christ so that your explanation lasts forever, you have created an idol, because God cannot be bound in the vocabulary or the knowledge of your mind or mine. So are there aspects of the Jesus story that are composite? Oh yes, I'm quite sure of that. There's some Old Testament stories that are wrapped around Jesus. Did he really do them? Or was that a way of explaining his power? If you become convinced that Jesus is the person in whom the kingdom of God is breaking into human history, and you know that the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 35 that when the kingdom of God breaks into human history, you'll be able to see the signs of it. And what are they going to be? They are that the blind will see and the deaf will hear and the lame will leap and the mute will sing. So it becomes quite clear that you wrap stories about each of those things around the Jesus of history. There are a lot of miracle stories that appear. Is the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 something that really happened? Or is that an attempt on the part of the followers of Jesus to take the God-giving manna to the children of Israel in the wilderness in great abundance and transferring that story to Jesus? Read it sometimes. It's really fascinating. Why do you suppose they gather up 12 baskets of fragments on the Jewish side of the lake and gather up 7 baskets of fragments on the Gentile side of the lake? Are those symbols? There are 12 tribes of Israel. The Jews would have known 7 Gentile empires. If you go back through their history, you can count them. Are those symbols? Elijah raises the only son of a widow from the dead. Luke says Jesus raised the only son of a widow from the dead. You compare that Elijah story with that Jesus story in Luke, and it's very, very similar. And stories of ascending into the sky are in almost every religion. Did Jesus really ascend? Before he died, Carl Sagan was a friend of mine, a brilliant man, a wonderful spirit. By his ethnicity, he was Jewish. By his theological perspective, he was a rather militant atheist. But Carl was a funny kind of atheist. He was what I call a God-intoxicated atheist. He talked about God more than I did. And we were at a conference in Washington about 4 years before he died. I think it was about 1996. And he came rushing across the room and he said, "Jack, have you ever wondered what the ascension of Jesus looked like to an astrophysicist?" And I said, "No, Carl, I've never thought about that, but I was sure I was going to have to." And if you remember, he sort of talked with his hands. He said, "Do you know that if Jesus literally ascended into the sky, and if he traveled at the speed of sound, the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, he hadn't yet gotten out of our galaxy?" And then he said, "And our galaxy is one of billions and billions and billions of galaxies." I thought he was going to have a religious experience. But if you know, as I think I know, that the story of Jesus' ascension, which appears only in the Gospel of Luke, is a story of Elijah's ascension into heaven being magnified, then it becomes a story trying to interpret the power of the experiences. Somehow what you see in Jesus is also what you see in God. And I think that's exactly what it is. So are there additions to the Jesus story that make him something more of a composite figure? Yes, there are. But is there a figure of history upon whom these stories are appropriately laid? Yes, there is. The question you need to ask is, why did it seem appropriate to them to tell a virgin birth story about Jesus. Did anybody ever tell a virgin birth story about you? The fact is, nobody waits outside a maternity ward for a great person to be born. Have you ever thought about that? You become a great person, and then they say, well, the moment you were born was a special moment for human history. Then you go back and develop your stories. Now, I realize that we're sort of a colony of Atlanta right now at Chautauqua, but I lived in Richmond for a while, where I think Robert E. Lee had almost achieved the status of being the fourth person of the Holy Trinity. And so when I was talking to my Richmond congregation, and I said, you know, nobody was outside Robert E. Lee's birthplace. And if you can't do it for Robert E. Lee, you can't do it for anybody. And that's when you say body. And Last Supper. It's the story of Jesus is far more complex than just an historical portrait. That's what I've been trying to say this week in this class. The Gospels are far more profound than we've given them credit for being. But you'll never know that until you get underneath the literalism and try to understand that there's an experience that cannot finally be explained, trying to be explained in the language and concepts of first century Judaism. That's what the Gospels are. You don't invalidate them when you discover they're not literal. You only go deeper into them. And I'm sorry to take so long. Are we at a lady or a gentleman? We're at a lady.
Thank you, Bishop Spong. Many of your comments today were related to Jesus' family, particularly his mother. But my question relates to his brother or brothers, particularly James. You mentioned that in Paul doesn't think much of James. In Acts, Luke doesn't think much better of him then than in Paul. Why is it when we get to John that there is really nothing about James at all? Is James so passé, so conservative, he's been dead for 30 years? Or does he show up in John, but in a story-type way that I can't see or recognize?
I don't think James shows up in John, but it is 95 to 100. And James, the brother of Jesus, according to the best we know, was executed by a mob somewhere in the 50s. So he'd been dead a right long time, so he wasn't a vital force. He's a vital force in Paul because Paul was writing at the time that James headed up a particular movement within the Christian faith that was very much more Jewish than Paul was. Paul was the prophet or the apostle that wanted to take the Christian message out of its Jewish womb and turn it into a universal message that would include Gentiles. And so James was his opponent in that. And according to the best we can put together, and there are some people that have written books on this James that are far more learned than I am, but the best we can put together, James was the head of the Christian community which was far more deeply Jewish in Jerusalem. And Paul challenged the Jerusalem church by bringing all these converts in. In fact, that starts in, according to the book of Acts. Don't trust the book of Acts. How many minutes ago did you put this up here? 4 minutes ago. The thing says 5 minutes more, and I wonder how many. I just saw it. I just think that by the time John writes, the Johannine community has been excommunicated from the synagogue. There's a great deal of hostility between the Johannine community and the Orthodox party within the synagogue. They'd been saying rather bad things about each other, and the tensions were so great, and they had been expelled, and that's when they began to talk about the Jews, and they don't mean themselves at this point, they mean the Orthodox party. And so it gets very tense. But Paul is 50 years earlier, and Paul is still battling. Paul has won by the time John is written. Not just one, but Paul has sort of turned away. If you read the last epistle that we think Paul wrote, which is Philippians, you find that Paul himself is turning in a very mystical direction. Read the 2nd chapter of Philippians to get documentation on that. That's about as far as my time will allow me to go, and I'll take one more if I can answer it quickly.
Yes, I'm from Beaufort, South Carolina. I'd sure like to see you down there.
Thank you. I might get hanged.
My question is, would be the first reverse lynching in history. But I am interested in the technical things that you do. For example, I'm an avid reader of yours. Two things underlie almost all your writings: a vast knowledge of the Jewish tradition as it applies to the New Testament. The other thing that really fascinates me is, let's take a date like 850 BC. You will say, before this epistle was written, here's what was going on. The Goths were coming down, the weather was bad. I'm waiting for you to tell us what the weather was that day, okay? So where does this research come from? What are your sources? How do you do this?
There's not much I can say about that in the 30 seconds that remains to me. And we do got to move out because our keynoter of the week is going to be here to talk about his book. There are some ways that these things can be dated. Internal evidence is the primary way. The big thing is that we can date from history the fact that the Roman army conquered Jerusalem in the year 70. So when you begin to get chapters like chapter 13 of Mark, which seems to describe the chaos that happened when Jerusalem was falling, you begin to suspect he has to write it on the other side of the year 70. You also get in Mark, for the first time, the story of the Transfiguration, where the light of God is restored not to the temple, but to Jesus, and Moses and Elijah are standing there with him. I don't believe they could tell that story of the light of God coming down on Jesus and not on the temple if the temple still existed. So it's another bit of evidence that we're after 70. When we get into the epistles, we can sort of watch Paul grow, and then we can watch some things develop that Paul surely wasn't a part of. And so you can begin to say, we know that Paul died probably around 64. So if you get an epistle that refers to some things in the life of the church or some things in the life of the society that are after 54 or 64, then you assume they can't be written by Paul, and you begin to try to find other data to put them in there. There are people that spend their whole career on dating the New Testament and studying the history of what was happening in that period of time. One contemporary is the Jewish historian Josephus, who tells the story of the war between Rome and the Jews. It started in 66, it ended in 73 at a place called Masada, but Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. So those are the kinds of ways. But as I say, there are people that spend their entire life just giving me their research so I can put the story back into the place. It's an interesting, I wouldn't want to do that kind of study, but I appreciate the fact that they do it and feed me with it. But I think it's fairly accurate. I think we can document it fairly accurately. Folks, we've got to move so that our wonderful keynoter can come in. Thank you.